This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And this is A Different Perspective, and I am Kevin Randle. Normally, I begin the program with what I now call something of an intense monologue. But since I was going to talk about the latest information coming out from the DOD and various government agencies about the new UAP report, and Curt Collins is very, very interested in all of that and is informed about it as I am, I thought he and I would discuss it in this program, as well as some of the other aspects of the UFO phenomenon. For those of you who don't know, Curtis Collins is the author behind Blue Blurry Lines, the website focused on the UFO mystery as well as its legends and hoaxes. After a career in retail management, Curt began writing about UFOs with a special interest in reinvestigating the paradoxical 1980 Texas Cash Landrum case. In 2015, Curt was on the investigative team, the Roswell Slides Research Group, that exposed the BeWitness alien photo fiasco, and that was quite the fiasco, I'll tell you. More recently, he launched the Saucers That Time Forgot with Claude Falkstrom, focused on unearthing tales of UFO history has overlooked and would rather forget. Curt lives in southern United States near Jackson, Mississippi. There's some additional material and credits to be found on his bio page, which is www.blueberrylines.com/p/Curt Collins is the author behind blueberry.html. Saucers That Time Forgot is, of course, the saucersthattimeforgot.com, and Blue Blurry Lines is www.blueblurrylines.com. Curt Collins, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Oh, good to be here. So we're anticipating a new UAP report. It was supposed to be out Monday, and we're waiting.
Well, I think there was a release that Congress had gotten the classified version on Monday, and we get the unclassified version on Friday.
Well, great. I'm eager to see it. And so the New York Times had a story with supposedly some material sourced by insiders, and that's all we really know about it so far. ABC News verified some of the details, and it doesn't sound like good news if you're looking for alien contact.
Well, I would say that what we know right now is from unsourced insiders. We don't know who they are. We don't know how inside they are. We don't know what they know or what they don't know. So I'm afraid that it's not going to be of much value to us. But I will note here that according to some of the things I've said, they have explained some of the 144 unexplained sightings they mentioned, a year and a half ago. The gimbal video that we talk about, the Navy video, has been identified as a drone, I think, is what they're saying now. And it looks like they're going to explain most of the UFO sightings as balloons and drones and things like that. And I think a number of people have said, and I are on board of this, drones are becoming the new weather balloons.
That's right. Well, there were a lot of balloons then, and there are a lot of drones now. So they certainly are responsible for some sightings, but there's even the Pentagon admits one solution doesn't cover it all. But you mentioned the videos. So the three famous videos that the New York Times helped popularize, Gimbal and Go Fast, they say those two have been explained. One is basically an illusion. I think it's parallax is what causes that. And then the Go Fast, they said, is only going about 30 miles an hour, if that New York Times story is accurate. So they've eliminated those possibly as phenomenal or anomalous. So, they're still unknown, but in Nimitz, apparently that video remains of interest.
Well, the thing that I noticed in their discussion about all of this was the reason that they had been hesitant to say anything publicly about this was they were afraid of tipping off our opponents in the world, the Chinese specifically, that we were aware they were using drones to spy on our fleet training exercises and our fleet movements and that sort of thing, which I found ridiculous. Because the moment the videos came out and we were talking about this sort of thing going on at that location at that specific time, the Chinese or whoever it was, if it was a terrestrial agency spying on our fleet, would have known that we had detected their drones. So the excuse for not releasing the information is preposterous.
Well, the military is always secretive. They don't want to give anything about how they gather information, the technical capabilities. So I don't think they were really excited about those videos coming out because you could sort of understand the limitations of the equipment. So, so I'm really interested in the fact that has been progress made. There's still legislation coming up there. They may even change the name of the organization to something else. But from what I understand, the Navy is still doing most of the organizational work, the investigation, coordinating with other agencies. And so now, of course, we're joined by NASA. It has its own, it's really a study of not classified information. I think they're trying to bring their group up to speed on the topic, so that they can be a contributor. At least that's my understanding of it.
I looked at the list of the 16 scientists who've been brought in. I noticed right off bat, one of them was a fellow with SETI or worked with SETI, had a kind of a SETI connection there. And I think John Greenwald and a couple of others pointed out that a number of them have a SETI background. And I always found that a bit problematic, giving SETI's opinions about UFOs. They're searching for extraterrestrial life, but they're ignoring UFOs, which I think would have been something they would want to explore a little bit carefully if they're really truly looking for extraterrestrial life. Because if UFOs are alien spacecraft, well, that's the extraterrestrial life right here over the United States.
So yeah, it was an interesting group of people, though. They got to start somewhere, and the people they're familiar with are the ones they're going to choose. So let's hope that they do open things up a bit. But I'm not pinning my hopes all on NASA. They're beginners at this. Let's hope that they're willing to look at the evidence. And supposedly what they're doing is open and not classified, and that's kind of the disappointment I have with the UAPTF or their successor, is that they're only looking at military cases, and they're unlikely to really share much of that information with us. I think what we've gotten so far is a good taste of what to expect in the future, which is not a lot of detail. Summaries, presentations to Congress, maybe reports that are, and there's some information online. The Navy site has a list of UAP reports released through the Freedom of Information Act. And occasionally new ones appear, one from October 13th on mostly what appears to be drone sightings. So, there is some new material. Of course, those reports are redacted. So there's some hope, but it's not an open book. Absolutely.
Well, I was always concerned because when we watched the press conference that they had last May, it seemed to me what they were telling us is all these reports, they're going to focus on military reports, specifically pilot reports, I would imagine, from all the services. But those reports would be born classified because of the equipment being involved or the personnel being involved and that sort of thing. So it's going to be classified for a variety of reasons. And I understand the hesitation to reveal everything that we are capable of doing because we don't want our competitors to know exactly what we can do. And some of the redactions would suggest that they're protecting sources of information and equipment that is being used. But by the same token, they were only going to look at the military aspect of this. And so when NASA announced they were going to look at the civilian aspect of it, I thought, well, at least that's a move in the right direction. We're not going to disqualify certain sightings simply because they didn't come from military personnel.
That's right. And so the FAA's involvement is maybe an indication there's some hope to deal with those things. But I think it's only, I don't think they want civilian reports. The only thing with the air safety, national security, that's probably all they're going to address. So civilian researchers can't hang up their hats. So we're going to have to continue to press forward, ask for information. And, I think there's some information out there, but there's like airline reports, their policy is not to share a lot of information. So it's going to, hopefully the pilots are more comfortable doing so. Maybe that'll still have to be anonymous, but, I'm relatively optimistic about things, but I just am not going to depend on the government opening up every file,
Well, I'm very pessimistic because I've watched the government do this sort of thing for literally decades. Although I wasn't much of an observer in 1953 with the Robertson panel, I remember the Condon Committee and their conclusions and some of the things that have been said. We're going to have to take a break here. I'm here with Curt Collins. He of Blue Blurry Lines, which is a wonderful site if you're interested in the Cash Landrum sighting and other things like that. And we're going to talk a little bit about his other project, which is Flying Saucers That Time Forgot. I'll have a longer analysis of our feelings about what's going on with the DoD and the upcoming reports that will be released on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And I do reference the Level Land case in that. So if you want to understand exactly all that information, take a look at the book Level Land, which you can get off Amazon at any time. Well, I will be back right after this with Curt Collins, so please stick around.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm having my morning coffee.
Beautiful Mind coffee is delicious coffee your brain will love. Made with ethically sourced 100% Arabica coffee grown in the volcanic soil of the Tolima, Colombia region, Beautiful Mind coffee is roasted and ground in small batches to ensure each bag contains a wonderful full-bodied artisan coffee. Beautiful Mind coffee contains herbal ingredients to aid in boosting your daily mental clarity and focus. Maca root powder, green tea extract, and American ginseng have all been selected for their ability to support good brain health. Taking care of your brain's health now can help delay or prevent the onset of cognitive dysfunction, including dementia, Alzheimer's, and more general memory loss as you get older just by enjoying the delicious flavor of our roasted coffee and herbal ingredients found exclusively in Beautiful Mind coffee. For more information on Beautiful Mind coffee, visit us online at www.beautifulmindcafe.com. Beautiful Mind coffee is now available at amazon.ca.
And I am back. I'm joined by Curt Collins. We're talking about UFOs. We're talking about the government's upcoming reports on their UAPs, their attempt to change our thinking from UFOs to UAPs, which I think is one of the other things that the government does periodically, change the acronyms, and maybe we'll forget about all that stuff that went on in the past. And that's another thing that kind of worries me about this government program. I was wondering if they had any interest in looking at the history of UFOs, because I think there's an awful lot of good cases out there, cases in which there are multiple chains of evidence, multiple witnesses, evidence that was gathered electronically or through instrumentality, a word that I love, by the way, instrumentality. And I wondered, did you realize, or were you aware of that lack of looking at the history, and did that bother you at all?
It does. And so the Galileo project by Avi Loeb has a similar focus, which is just they want new information, new cases, and instrumentation and things like that. But I agree with you. There's some cases that have all the things they want, except, the final answer that are worth looking at. So, yeah, I understand the point of view. I think it's a bit, I don't know, almost narcissistic to them to say only what we gather is important, though.
Well, you mentioned good cases in the past that they should look at. What are some of those cases?
Oh, well, a person like Jan Aldrich can probably recall those instantly, but the ones where I can't cite them offhand, but the Blue Book has plenty of instances where there are multiple military witnesses. In fact, they weren't even interested in single witness cases. So if you look, most of the reports and the things they investigated, it was from multiple credible witnesses. Sometimes you had the radar data and, the sighting from a pilot. Sometimes there's more than that, but any film is very elusive. One thing I wanted to mention before we got too far away from it, you brought up Levelland, and a lot of what's going on now is the result of public pressure. There was a lot of public pressure from Levelland. I was looking at some of the old reports of that, and afterwards, people writing in demanding to their legislators, is this a secret government thing? And if it is, we need to know about it. And even one of the local politicians did that wrote to the Washington asking on that we need to calm the citizens. They shouldn't be made afraid if this is a secret project. Have you come across that sort of thing about the public outrage about the sightings?
I know that there was a lot of questioning going on by the public, but I know that the Air Force resisted making any kind of public statement right after the Levelland sightings in 1957. And in the Project Blue Book files, there's a memo for the record or a document that says we're waiting to see what NICAP has to say. NICAP being the Civilian National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Their thinking was that it's much easier to respond to something than it is to create the initial document. And so they waited for NICAP to come out. And I think that Don Kehoe, who was the director of NICAP, and I say that not so that you know, but to keep the audience on board, said that there had been 9 witnesses to this object over Levelland that stalled their car engines and filled the radios with static and put out the headlights and that sort of thing. And there was witnesses at separate locations calling in to the Levelland Sheriff or the Levelland Police Department with their reports. The Air Force investigation, which lasted most of a day, part of a day, wasn't very comprehensive. And they said, well, there were only 3 witnesses to the object. I was going through the Air Force file. I think I found notes that at least 5 people talked about objects. So that kind of negates the Air Force conclusion. Kehoe was talking about 9, and I found many additional witnesses who saw the object had their car stolen. If you look at some of the statements by the Levelland Sheriff, and there's some of them on the internet, as a matter of fact, on YouTube, he was talking about literally dozens of people calling in to report this thing over Levelland. So you've got literally dozens of witnesses independently reporting it because, and I have to make this case in today's environment simply because there was not the instantaneous news that we get today. So if it happened today, people would have known about it within moments and they'd be outside looking for it. In 1957, there was television and radio and the newspapers, and there wasn't this instantaneous reporting of stuff, so that when the people started calling in within the space with 2 hours, 2.5 hours to the Levelland Sheriff, it wasn't as if they'd gotten it off social media or something like that. They were reporting what they observed. So the sheriff himself went out to look. And what I find interesting is in the first reports, he talked about seeing a oval-shaped object, a bright glowing red-shaped object. When you get to the Air Force document, he talks about a streak of light in the distance. And then later on, Don Berliner, and I know you know who Don Berliner is, was with the Fund for UFO Research and interviewed the sheriff. Ware Clem was his name, and I've always hated that name. Something great like Jack Armstrong would have been perfect. But Ware Clem told Berliner then that he had seen an oval-shaped object. And I think, that kind of negates some of the Air Force investigation. But what is also important is the sheriff the next day, which would have been November 3rd, took his car into the police mechanic to have it checked. The only reason I can think that he would have done that is if he got close enough to the object that it stalled his car engine. And so the sheriff became a witness to what is going on. But more importantly, he was followed by another car in this mini convoy they had with by the Texas Department of Public Safety, which I think was the name in 1957, which is basically the state police, the highway patrol. But more importantly, there was another car following him filled with Air Force officers. So if the sheriff's car stalled, it would have stalled the car behind him and the car behind them, which means the Air Force officers were in a car that was stalled. And there's very limited documentation, but I did find some to suggest the Air Force was much more heavily involved in this. But those reports from those Air Force officers never make it into Project Blue Book. So it is a very important case. I spent quite a bit of time doing a book on level land and the fallout from it. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, sure. It's the anniversary of the case, so we should be talking about it.
Yeah, good point. Today is November 2nd. I shouldn't say that. We try not to put a date on the program. Yes, it's November 2nd, so it is the anniversary of the case. Absolutely. Good point. But I also was thinking, of other cases, and you may have had a chance to think yourself. I think the Washington Nationals from 1952, where you had multiple sightings by pilots, both civilian and military. There were intercepts run. There were radars in 3 separate locations reported the objects. And the Air Force explanation was, well, it was a weather related phenomena, a temperature inversion. I know you're familiar with the case. What did you think
historic. Yeah. So that's one of the few cases that, Leveland is one because of the impact it made. It belongs in the history books, and the Washington National case even more so because it affected policy. And that was one of the cases that's really interesting because it's one of the few times that the Air Force was prompted to speak to the public to address the controversy and to try to calm them down. And as you say, they mentioned weather inversions, and that doesn't really explain the sightings from the air, which I don't think were as pervasive. I think the radar was what really got them going, and then the fact pilots were seeing them continued interest. But nevertheless, it had a huge impact, and the at least parts of the address by General Sanford are online. These famous remarks of credible observers seeing relatively incredible things. And that's a line for the ages.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about the Washington Nationals, on the second night of the sightings, it was 2 consecutive Saturday nights in July of 1952. There were a number of people in the radar room that night, military people or associated with the military. Al Chop being the Pentagon spokesman about UFOs, but he was a civilian, and of course Dewey Fournet, who was the liaison officer between the Pentagon and Project Blue Book, an Air Force officer. I was able to talk to both of those men a number of years ago about their sightings. It was their opinion, being in the radar room, listening to what the reporters or the radar operators were saying, that these were not weather-related phenomena that they were watching on their scopes. It was something much more solid, much more real. And the one thing that was interesting, one of them told me, and I'm not sure who it was, which one it was. I have to go back and look at my notes for that. But one of them said it was kind of interesting that every time the fighters showed up, all the UFOs disappeared. And once the fighters went back to their home station, left the area, the UFOs came back. I thought it was kind of an interesting comment.
I'm sure that the Air Force would say that in the presence of a solid target, the illusions were reduced on the scope. But I don't know. But it's something that there was enough military involvement and public awareness in both Leveland and the 1950 Washington National case that it couldn't be ignored. And we need an event like that to get the public interested and involved and really demand some answers. Whereas these military cases are so remote and we have such little information, people find interesting, but they're not involved.
Well, I know you've done a lot of work on the Cash Landrum case, which seems to me to be one of those cases where you have an awful lot of good information and multiple witnesses and that sort of thing. When we come back, let's talk a little bit about the Cash Landrum case and your investigation of it, and what's on your website or your blog, which would be www.blueblurrylines.com. I know you've got a lot of information up there. And as I say, I don't do it enough, and I'm just terrible at this, not promoting my own work and that sort of thing. But there's an awful lot of information at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and I try to come at it with a dispassionate point of view. And yes, I'm somewhat biased, and I think we all have to say our biases show up. I do come down on the extraterrestrial side of the fence periodically, much more so than some of the others. There are some very good cases that defy conventional explanation, terrestrial explanation, and I think that can lead us to the extraterrestrial. It doesn't get us there, but it can lead us in that direction. So when we come back with Curt Collins, we'll talk about Cash Landrum and see what that does for us in that respect. So please stick around.
So I was watching the X Zone TV channel last night when I was abducted by aliens, and they kept repeating to me over and over again, simultv.com, simultv.com.
What's simultv.com?
That's what I asked them. They had it written on the side of their UFO.
How do you spell that?
UFO.
No, I mean simultv.com.
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 Right. simultv.com.
Interesting that you were abducted by aliens in a simultv.com UFO last night.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Now that you mention it, I remember now last night I was awakened from a deep sleep. My great-grandmother was standing there. She said she come from the hereafter to tell me about simultv.com. She even spelled it out for me.
simultv.com, sonny boy.
simultv.com.
simultv.com, sonny boy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Guys, you'll never guess what my psychic guru just told me.
simultv.com.
Exactly. Are you guys psychic too?
Of course.
We all know about simultv.com. simultv.com.
And we are back. I'm here with Curt Collins. We're talking about UFOs and that sort of thing. And I had a thought while we were at the break. I should have mentioned that I did do a book on Levelland, and you can go to Amazon.com and get it right now, so you can learn all about the Levelland sightings. So take a look at that. There's a link to that book on my blog if you wish to take that route. When we went away, I had mentioned the Cash Landrum sightings from December of 1980, I believe, at the same time as the Rendlesham Forest sightings. And I know you've done quite a bit of work on that. Fill us in a little bit on that sighting, on that case.
December 29th, 1980, two women in their 50s and one of the ladies' grandson were out. They'd gone to had dinner and looked for a bingo game, and were on a rural road. They saw what they originally thought was a plane, light from a plane, and they saw this large object, which in some respects is oval and bright, similar to the Levelland sighting. And there's some controversy as to whether or not their engine stopped, because it wasn't in the original report, but was claimed later. And they stopped to look at it. It was blocking. It was in the road ahead of them. And, it's a pretty long story, so I'm just going to give you the short version so we can talk about it. But they were afraid to get any closer to it. They observed it, and when it finally left, they observed 23 helicopters that they thought were escorting it, and maybe in case it crashed. So that persuaded them later that there was military involvement. So, we've never been able to prove helicopters were involved. Some people even speculated things like this was a projection or a hologram, a defense mechanism of the UFO. There's a lot of theories about what happened and why. But in the aftermath of the incident, the witnesses, particularly Betty Cash, fell ill and had to be hospitalized. She suffered hair loss and some symptoms that resemble radiation poisoning. And even though there was no trace of ionizing radiation found in her blood, there was a mystery, and there's the thought that the UFO must have had something to do with her health problems. And the other two witnesses, Vicki Landrum and her grandson Colby Landrum, who was just short of 7 at the time, they had flu-like symptoms and complained of skin problems similar to sunburn. And so they had to, and Betty's were far worse than that. She had these skin irritation that was like blister-like, and was weak and had severe headaches, lots of problems along those lines.
Well, didn't one of them got out of the car, and I think the other 2 stayed in the car, which may have protected them somewhat from the effects of this object, whatever it was. Did you look into that at all, or?
They all got out at one time, but Betty was out longer than the others. And it's been theorized that to have the symptoms that caused the hair loss, it would have been a lethal dose of radiation that the car wouldn't have protected the others. So it's a puzzle. And it's even been suggested that maybe some of the symptoms were caused by some sort of chemical exposure, even fuel from helicopters, but nothing fits. The injuries are anomalous. They're unexplained. We can't trace the man-made technology. You can't blame it absolutely on health problems. There seems to be a connection between the two. And some people have even suggested it was hoaxed, but there's no simple single answer, and it remains puzzling. And there's some contradictory details. There's no question about that. But the case received a lot of attention. This was in 1980, so there was no blue book to investigate it. They did go to the Air Force to report the problem, and they said, well, it can't be investigated. But at Bergstrom Air Force Base, they did take testimony from the witnesses and pass that along.
There was no indication of any kind of experimental craft being tested at that time in that location. And we have to remember, this is over the Christmas holidays, basically, when everything shuts down. And I know as a former military officer that during the Christmas holidays, they do their best to allow everyone to be with their family. So a lot of soldiers are on leave, not with their units and that sort of thing. Something of that nature being tested over that period of time, meaning the Christmas holidays, seems a little bit unusual that it would be something that we would be doing.
Very much so. Now the best military theory has to do with so I remember this, I'm old enough, but there were hostages held in Iran. That was a huge problem for the United States. And some people say that's why President Jimmy Carter wasn't elected and Ronald Reagan was, because of he was a leader that would take military action. And as it happens, during the change of presidents, the hostages were released. But at that time, that was a huge concern. They were even practicing helicopters. There was a failed mission that had trained in 1979 at Area 51. That was one of the first times Area 51 became known. So there's some speculation that the helicopters were involved in relation to training for a second rescue mission. And maybe the UFO was like a battlefield illumination device that would be used. I've looked at that. I can't, it's like looking at the Jack the Ripper case. You can find suspects, they're in the right city maybe, and you can draw lines between them, but you can't put them in the place and connect them to the crime. So there's a possibility, but as you say, the military these people were home with their families mostly. I just don't think there was and remember, you know this better than anyone probably, that the manpower to fly and support 23 helicopters would have been immense. A lot of people have to know about that, and there would have to be the potential for a lot of leaks. And all these years later, we don't have a credible source of information to support it.
Well, the one thing that I know from my experience is when you're talking about the crew for a helicopter, you have to figure 3 pilots, even though only 2 would be flying at a time. So you're talking about, 75 pilots, something like that. Then you've got the crew, the crew chief, or flight engineer, or who else. I think they were talking about it being Chinook helicopters. So it's the big twin engine helicopters that you see in a lot of the movies. So you've got a huge crew, and then you've got to have the support, the logistics. Where are you going to refuel all these helicopters? Where are you going to provide food and shelter for the soldiers involved in this whole thing? There's an awful lot of logistics to go in. But what I was going to say when you brought up the hostage crisis, which struck me interestingly, because we all know the military kind of goes off duty during the Christmas holidays. It'd be the perfect time to stage a raid into in this case, Iran, to get the hostages back, because they wouldn't be expecting it. So that would be something that would be a consideration, but you find no evidence of any sort of military operation like that in the planning stages in the documentation of any of the units that would have been involved.
Due to the publicity of the case, the military was put in an awkward position of having to conduct a UFO-related investigation when they had no facilities to do so. When at that time, after Project Blue Book, to the best of our knowledge, if there was some sort of sighting by a pilot, they handled it internally. There was no centralized effort, and there was no military or government involvement in UFO sightings whatsoever. They just didn't listen. But in this case, they did, because there'd been a complaint. I think it was Representative Ron Wyden who made an inquiry, and so that put it in motion that the Inspector General of the Army ordered. And really, the scope of their investigation was really limited to the involvement of Army helicopters. But the investigator, George Saran, in order to be thorough, he asked questions of the witnesses, about the involvement of helicopters, and he was unable to determine any helicopters were involved, but still, it was essentially a UFO investigation. That information was recorded and later released through the Freedom of Information Act. So we have some good testimony of who he interviewed, what was said, and the fact that there was a good faith effort made. Later, the witnesses, on their behalf, a lawyer filed a civil suit, and the government became involved again in the defense of that. And they even contacted NASA, all the military branches, and the heads of those organizations had to state, no, we don't have any device that resembles the UFO that was reported. And that essentially shut the case down and never went to trial.
Well, I think they also pointed out that since there was no evidence that the military was involved in any way, I think they filed suit against the military for compensation, and they didn't. It failed because they couldn't prove that the government, the military, had any responsibility for their injuries. And if it was an alien spacecraft, of course, it wouldn't be the military that was responsible for it if they were chasing the thing. We're going to have to take our last break here. When we come back, I want to talk to you about flying saucers that time forgot. I think that's an interesting topic, and I know I read your columns, or you send them out periodically. I'm not sure if it's every week or every month, but I do enjoy reading the columns about flying saucers that time forgot. That blog, of course, is cleverly called the saucers that time forgot.com. Get it right there. My blog, of course, is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and on there you're going to find a on one side of it, a number of books that you can just click on, and it takes you to Amazon to take a look at the books, see if there's something interesting. And I've gotten some interesting reviews about Roswell, understanding Roswell, people finding that the in-depth analysis of some of that is helpful to their understanding of the case. So you might want to take a look at that. I'll be back right after this with Curt Collins, and we'll be talking about the flying saucers that time forgot.
Beautiful Mind Coffee is delicious coffee your brain will love. Made with ethically sourced 100% Arabica coffee grown in the volcanic soil of the Tolima, Colombia region, Beautiful Mind Coffee is roasted and ground in small batches to ensure each bag contains a wonderful full-bodied artisan coffee. Beautiful Mind Coffee contains herbal ingredients to aid in boosting your daily mental clarity and focus. Maca root powder, green tea extract, and American ginseng have all been selected for their ability to support good brain health. Taking care of your brain's health now can help delay or prevent the onset of cognitive dysfunction, including dementia, Alzheimer's, and more general memory loss as you get older, just by enjoying the delicious flavor of our roasted coffee and herbal ingredients found exclusively in Beautiful Mind Coffee. For more information on Beautiful Mind Coffee, visit us online at www.beautifulmindcafe.com. Beautiful Mind Coffee is now available at amazon.ca.
And I am back. I'll be joined here by Curt Collins in just a moment. Wanted to say once again, please take a look at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, because I never say that enough, apparently. When we went away, I had mentioned that I was going to ask Curt specifically about his series called Flying Saucers That Time Forgot. Tell us about Flying Saucers That Time Forgot.
Well, it's an outgrowth of my cache landing research, because when I first became interested in UFOs, I had heard about the status of that case, and I really thought, okay, well, this is something we can solve. We can trace it to the military. And then as I looked at aspects of that, I thought, well, wait a minute, the UFO sounds like this Loch Raven Dam UFO. It sounds a little bit like the Levelland UFO. So I needed to learn about that. What about radiation exposure? So that took me to UFO history. And there were a lot of cases, though, that are not famous. And in the series, I tend to stay away from the most famous cases unless I find a really unusual or overlooked aspect to it. And I try to focus on some of the things that aren't so well known, although they may have been at the time. There were a lot of things that are basically one-day wonders, and some of the strange figures too. We have a sub-series called The Ufologists That Time Forgot, on people who either were witnesses, or there were a lot of lecturers on UFOs before we had television and it took over for our entertainment. A lot of people attended local lectures, both in the evening and sometimes lunch lectures. And Kenneth Arnold gave some of those. And there were a lot of not only national stars, but a lot of little local stars. And they were the UFOs guy for their city. And some of those people did interesting things and made presentations. So trying to give it some exposure to some forgotten UFO history. So that's what's behind that.
Well, what are some of the things that you found? Some of the interesting people you may have featured in the program, or some of the interesting cases that weren't as well known?
It's interesting how a lot of things seem to repeat. So there's the article that's up there currently is about Eugene Drake. And no one's heard of him today, but in 1950, he published this book about how he had met these people from Venus, gone on their ship, and talked about their beauty and their peaceful ways. And then a few years later, George Adamski was telling a very similar story, and he's the figure that really brought the alien contact and the contactee movement in. And it looks like Adamski, once you look at allegedly Dr. Drake, Reverend Drake, his work, it looks like Adamski was a copycat. So, maybe his sighting is a little less genuine. And we're looking at Mr. Drake himself. He had been in the film business in the 1920s and was convicted of embezzling. So his background is a little sketchy too. So there is a lot of the people back in these early days that had a spiritual side to. They were connecting this visit from Venus with almost like a godlike experience, and there was an element of religion to it. There's that we were talking about Donald Kehoe and NICAP, which had a very scientific, non-esoteric view of things, and tried to look at the science and the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation from the fact that this is unexplained. Our science can't duplicate it. But these people already believed in this sort of thing on faith alone. And I think there was always a battle between Kehoe's camp and the people like Adamski who just wanted to believe.
Well, one thing I think we need to point out, you're talking about early 1950s. And back in the 1950s, the idea was Venus was surrounded by clouds, and they talked about it being tropical, very tropical. And that was why it was always surrounded by the clouds. It was always obscured by clouds. You couldn't see the surface of the planet. But now we know, having put probes onto Venus, that the spacecraft would probably melt when it landed there. Did you ever come across anything where they were trying to explain how the spacecraft would have survived, or how they survived on Venus with these extraordinarily high temperatures?
Oh. Well, there was one scoundrel, and he was convicted. And interesting thing about Reinhold Schmidt, his alleged sighting came on the heels of Leveland. It's possibly a copycat. Well, we know he's a hoaxer, so we'll say he was a copycat. He claimed to meet this a crew of people that spoke German on a cigar-shaped ship, and his story got bigger over time. He had multiple visits and everything. He was eventually tried in fraud connection. I don't think anyone has ever gone to jail for hoaxing a UFO, but if they bilk money from someone along the way, and which is what he had done, he was put on trial. And one of the people testifying as a scientific advisor was a young Carl Sagan. And so he testified that Venus was incapable of supporting life, and told what would happen to a person. And Reinhold Schmidt, his defense was basically, I'm just telling you what they told me. So he abdicated responsibility for the accuracy of his story. There was another person. They said that, well, it's Venus, but it's not the Venus that's sitting there. Basically, they claimed that it was a interdimensional realm. So, when you bring magic and things like that into it, there's always an answer.
Well, I think it's interesting that Carl Sagan was there disputing Reinhold Schmidt about having been to Venus and communicating with the people from Venus. Did he ever say he went to Venus, or just that they rode on their ships or communicated with them?
I think he rode on ships several times, but I think it was all around the Earth. And it was, in one case, he flew to the North Pole. In another case, he flew, and this one is so ridiculous. I don't even repeat much of it, but he flew to the pyramid where Jesus' body was taken after the crucifixion. And then he was told that afterwards, Jesus returned to the heavens in a flying saucer. So there were some really tall tales with Reinhold Schmidt's story.
In the last couple of minutes we have here, what obscure cases might you have looked at in the columns?
Well, some of them are scandalous, like in the wake of I think all your listeners have probably heard of the Socorro sighting in 1964, which is one of the best cases of all time. Well, afterwards, there was a case in, now I've forgotten the state, but it was a little north of there, and there were a group of kids that claimed that a UFO landed there, and it also left marks. Well, they stuck by their story, but the Air Force investigators said that, well, these marks aren't uniform. They appeared to be just burned in the ground, and they determined it was a hoax. And it's one of the few cases where the Air Force has accused a person outright of hoaxing, much less children. So, there are very few cases where it was overt. They might say it's non-credible or something like that. But so that was the really bold move. And you might think maybe on shaky legal ground to embarrass them like that.
Did you look at the Maury Island, or have you looked at the Maury Island case at all?
I have, and I've probably written just some of the side drama with that, but that's a famous one. And so what's tragic about that was that Kenneth Arnold was pulled into it, and it seems to have been a hoax. And I think it sort of damaged his long-lasting credibility to have been, if he was fooled by these hoaxers, and it sort of makes us question his judgment. But it was two men who claimed to be, they originally described as being harbor patrol, but actually they were salvaging logs from the lake. And they claimed that debris of this fleet of flying saucers, one of them was damaged, was dropping fragments, and it had damaged the ship. I think had broken the man's son's arm and killed the dog that was on board. Well, they couldn't find the son, and when they did later, he was uninjured, and the dog may have been made up, and the fragments that were later examined were just a common slag from like a metalwork shop. So and the way that this case made history, though, Kenneth Arnold had called in two of the people that had helped, that had been taking his testimony. They flew in. I don't know if this was right around the time when you're transitioning from Army Air Force to Air Force. And as they were leaving, the plane developed, I think it was an engine problem. Anyway, the two people he talked to didn't survive. Some of the other people on board were able to parachute out and escape. So it was the first UFO-related death, and it came as a result of a hoax.
Well, we're going to have to break it off there, I'm afraid. For those who are interested, I do cover part of this Maury Island stuff on my blog, so you can take a look there if you desire more information. But I think the Air Force, the military, pretty well determined it was a hoax. I think that's the truth. Curt, thank you so much for taking time. I know it was a little bit of an aggravation to get started here, but I appreciate hanging around to talk to us.
Oh yeah, glad we got together.
Okay, thank you so much. As I say, there's always information on my blog about the sightings we talk about, and if there's not, I try to get something up there for you to take a look at, or a suggestion of where you can go for additional information, solid information, good information about it. Maury Island, by the way, is published in a lot of books, so there's not any difficulty in finding out quite a bit of information about it. Easy for me to say, I know. Once again, take a look at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And if you take a look at the books that I write, please leave a rating or a review, because that does help us out getting the message to other people. Thank you for tuning in, and we will return in the near future.